I'm 27, working in marketing, and living in a cramped apartment with a roommate who leaves dishes everywhere. It's not ideal, but it's cheap, and I need cheap because every spare dollar I make is either going into my savings or back to my parents. They're not destitute, but they've always been in financial limbo, just barely keeping it together. My parents, Mark and Linda, have a history of bad decisions with money. My dad, for as long as I can remember, was always chasing the next big thing, investing in random business ventures that never worked out. My mom stayed at home and handled everything else, which was just code for patching up the messes Dad made. They meant well, I guess, but they were never stable. Then there's my sister, Jessica. She's 24 now, and still stuck in the same loop she's been in since high school. She didn't finish college, jumps from one part-time job to another, and spends most of her time figuring out who or what to blame for her life not working out. Mom and Dad call it a phase, but I'm pretty sure phases aren't supposed to last 6 years. Growing up, it was clear Jessica and I were treated differently. If she failed at something, it was, she's just trying to find her way. If I slipped up, it was, you're better than this. You have to set the example. They never said it outright, but it was obvious. Jessica was the one they felt sorry for, and I was the one they expected to fix everything. That expectation hit hard when I turned 18. My parents sat me down and explained how they'd taken out loans and drained their savings to get me through college. Dad said it was an investment in my future and how I was going to be the one to finally break the cycle. At the time, I was so focused on how proud they seemed of me that I didn't realize what they were really saying. I wasn't just their kid. I was their way out. I graduated and landed a decent job. Not great, but enough to start paying off my student loans and send a little money home. Every time I did, Mom would call me, teary-eyed, thanking me for how much I'd helped them. Dad, on the other hand, would always slip in little reminders about how much they'd sacrificed for me. You know, we could have used that money to retire early, he'd say, but we wanted to make sure you had a shot at something better. The guilt was constant. I don't even think they meant it to be, but every phone call felt like a reminder that I owed them, that I couldn't forget how much they'd given up for me. And the thing is, I didn't mind helping them out. They were my parents, and they'd done a lot to make sure I had opportunities they never did. I wanted to pay them back. But then, last year, they started dropping hints about wanting a house. It was always casual, never a direct ask, but it came up in every conversation. We're getting tired of renting, Mom would say. It's hard to feel settled when you're always moving around. I brushed it off at first. I mean, I was barely able to afford rent myself, let alone think about buying a house for someone else. But the comments kept coming, and they started feeling less like hints and more like pressure. Dad would bring up the sacrifices they'd made for me, how they'd worked so hard to get me through school, and how much it would mean to them to finally have a place to call their own. The tipping point came when I visited them for Christmas. We were sitting in the living room, and Dad brought it up again. This time not as a hint, but as a full-on suggestion. You're doing well now, he said, smiling at me like he already knew the answer. Maybe it's time to think about buying us a house. Just something simple. Nothing big. I laughed nervously, hoping it was a joke, but Mom jumped in immediately. It's not like we're asking for much, she said. You're so good with your money. We know you'll figure it out. I felt trapped. On one hand, I wanted to say no, to explain that I wasn't in a position to buy a house for anyone. But on the other hand, the guilt was crushing. They had helped me get to where I was, hadn't they? Didn't I owe them this? I tried to brush it off, saying, I'm barely making ends meet myself. I can't afford a house right now. But they didn't let it go. The rest of the visit was filled with little comments, subtle but pointed. We just want a small place, Mom said at one point. It doesn't have to be fancy. When I left, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I talked to them after that, the house came up. They'd talk about rent increases or how hard it was to deal with noisy neighbors. And every time, they'd circle back to the same thing. How much they'd done for me, how much it would mean to them. I knew it wasn't fair. I knew they were using guilt to get what they wanted. But the part of me that had spent my entire life trying to make them proud couldn't let it go. I convinced myself that it was the right thing to do, that if I could just pull this off, they'd finally be happy, and I'd finally be free of the pressure. So I did it. I drained my savings and bought them a house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest place in a quiet neighborhood, but it was theirs. They cried when I handed them the keys, and for a while, I felt like I'd done the right thing. But looking back, I realized that was just the beginning. The first few months after I bought the house felt like a win. Every phone call from Mom and Dad was full of gratitude. Mom would tell me about how she was decorating the place, how much she loved having her own garden. Dad would talk about how peaceful the neighborhood was, how much he appreciated finally having a place to call home. For a while, I let myself believe it was all worth it. I was still living in my tiny apartment, barely getting by, but I told myself it didn't matter. I'd given them something they'd always wanted. That was enough, right? Then the little comments started creeping back in. Mom mentioned how the kitchen was a bit outdated, and wouldn't it be great if they could replace the cabinets? Dad joked about how the roof might need repairs in a few years, and it'd be good to start planning for it now. At first, I didn't think much of it, just small talk about the house. But the comments became more frequent, more pointed. One day, Mom called and said, "We're thinking about redoing the bathroom. It's just so old-fashioned. Nothing crazy, of course, but it'd make the house feel more like home." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "That sounds nice," I said cautiously. There was a pause, and then she added, "We were wondering if you'd be able to help us cover the cost. You're so good at saving. It's just a couple $1,000s, and we'd pay you back eventually." I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. The same knot I'd felt every time they'd asked for something growing up, knowing there was no real way to say no. "I don't know," I said slowly. "I'm trying to save up for myself right now." Mom's tone changed instantly. She didn't sound angry, but there was this edge to her voice. "Oh, of course. I just thought, well, it's okay. Don't worry about it." That phrase, "don't worry about it," stuck with me all day. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a guilt trip. She was making it clear that she thought I should worry about it, that I was letting them down by not immediately jumping in to help. And it didn't stop there. Every time I visited, they had a new project they were dreaming about. New floors, updated appliances, a deck for the backyard. They never demanded anything outright, but the expectation was always there. "It'd be so nice to fix this up," they'd say, looking at me like I was the solution. Around this time, my sister Jessica started showing up more often in their conversations. Mom would casually mention how much Jessica loved visiting the house, how happy it made her to have a comfortable place to relax. "She's been going through a tough time," Mom said during one call. "It's so nice for her to have somewhere she feels safe." I didn't think much of it at first. Jessica had always bounced from one situation to another, so it made sense that she'd want to spend time with Mom and Dad. But then Mom started saying things like, "Jessica's been such a help around the house lately," or, "She's been staying with us for a bit. It's really nice having her here." I brushed it off, assuming it was temporary. Jessica was probably crashing with them while figuring things out, like she always did. But then I visited one weekend and saw it for myself. The house felt different the second I walked in. There were shoes by the door that weren't Mom's or Dad's. A pile of bags sat in the hallway, and a hoodie I recognized as Jessica's was draped over the back of the couch. When I walked into the kitchen, Jessica was standing there, making a sandwich like she owned the place. "Hey," she said casually, like it was no big deal that she was there. I tried to keep my tone light. "Staying here for a bit?" She shrugged. "Yeah, it's been nice. Mom and Dad said it's fine, so?" I felt a flicker of irritation but forced a smile. "Good for you," I said, trying not to let it show. When I sat down with my parents later that evening, I brought it up as casually as I could. "So, Jessica's been staying here?" Mom smiled, her voice light and cheerful. "Oh, just for a little while. You know how hard things have been for her lately. She needed a place to regroup." "And how long is she planning to regroup?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Mom hesitated, glancing at Dad. "We haven't really talked about it," she said finally. "She's helping us out around the house, though. It's been good for all of us." I wanted to press further, but something in Mom's tone stopped me. It was that same unspoken expectation I'd been dealing with for years. Jessica was struggling, so of course, it was my job to make it easier for her. As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. The house I'd worked so hard to buy for my parents was starting to feel like it wasn't even theirs anymore. Jessica had a way of taking over spaces, of making them hers without ever asking for permission. And my parents, as always, were letting her. It was the first time I wondered if I'd made a mistake. If giving them the house had been less about helping them and more about giving them another way to take advantage of me. But even then, I couldn't bring myself to confront it. Not yet. A couple of months after that visit, it became clear that Jessica wasn't just regrouping. She'd moved in. Permanently. Every time I talked to Mom, Jessica came up in the conversation. She's been so great, helping out with errands, Mom would say, or, it's nice having her around. It makes the house feel lively. At first, I kept my frustration to myself. It was their house, technically, even if I was the one paying for it. If they wanted Jessica there, what could I say? But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. I'd bought that house for them, not for Jessica to waltz in and take over. The breaking point came when I visited again. I told them I was coming, but when I got there, it wasn't Mom or Dad who opened the door. It was Jessica. She looked surprised, like she hadn't expected me to show up. "Oh, hey," she said casually, stepping aside to let me in. The place looked different. Jessica's things were everywhere. Her shoes lined up by the door, her books on the coffee table, her jacket hanging on the back of a chair. I glanced into the kitchen and saw a takeout box with her name scribbled on the lid. It wasn't just a temporary stay. She was living there, and she wasn't even trying to hide it. "Where are Mom and Dad?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "They're out," she said, grabbing her phone off the counter. "They'll be back later." I nodded, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. "So, how long have you been staying here?" She shrugged, scrolling through her phone like the question didn't matter. "A while, I guess. It's nice, you know? Better than dealing with roommates." Her tone was so casual, so matter-of-fact, like it hadn't even occurred to her that this wasn't her house. "And you're helping out with the mortgage?" I asked, knowing full well what the answer would be. She glanced up at me, confused. "What? No. Mom and Dad said they've got it covered." I didn't say anything, just stared at her for a moment before heading to the living room. I needed to sit down and process what I just heard. Jessica was living rent-free in the house I was paying for, and my parents were acting like it was completely normal. When they got home later, I brought it up immediately. "So, Jessica's living here now?" Mom looked at Dad, and Dad looked at the floor. "Well, you know," Mom said, trying to sound casual. "She's been having a tough time, and we thought it would be good for her to stay with us for a while." "She's not just staying," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "She's moved in. This was supposed to be your house, not hers." Mom sighed, her smile faltering. "Honey, she's helping us out so much. She runs errands, she cleans." I cut her off. "That's not the point. You didn't even tell me this was happening. I'm the one paying for this place, and you just let her move in like it's hers." Dad finally spoke up. "It's not a big deal," he said firmly. "We thought you'd understand. She's family, and she needs help." I stared at him, stunned. I've been helping her for years, helping all of you. But this is too much. Mom's expression shifted, her disappointment practically radiating off her. "We didn't think you'd make such a fuss about this," she said softly. "Jessica's your sister. She doesn't have the opportunities you do. You've always been the responsible one. We thought you'd want to help." There it was. The same argument I'd heard my entire life. Jessica's struggles somehow made her more deserving, while my hard work just made me the one they could rely on. I left that night feeling angrier than I'd ever felt. It wasn't just about Jessica. It was about the way my parents had treated me for years, like my success was their safety net. Like I didn't have the right to say no because I'd always been the one who had it together. On the drive home, I made up my mind. I was going to set boundaries, and this time, I wasn't going to let guilt talk me out of it. A few days after that visit, I called my parents. I'd spent the weekend replaying the conversation in my head, thinking about everything I should have said but didn't. This time, I wasn't going to hold back. When Mom picked up, she sounded cheerful, like nothing was wrong. "Hi, honey. How are you?" I didn't waste time on small talk. "We need to talk about the house," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Her tone shifted instantly. "What's wrong?" What's wrong is that Jessica has moved into the house I'm paying for, and you didn't even ask me if I was okay with it, I said. You didn't even tell me. Mom sighed, like I was being unreasonable. She's not living here forever, she said. She's just staying while she gets back on her feet. Mom, she's been getting back on her feet for years, I said. When does it stop being my responsibility to support her? There was a long pause before she answered. You make it sound like we're taking advantage of you, she said quietly. I didn't hold back. That's exactly what it feels like. I bought this house for you and Dad. I'm paying the mortgage so that you have a stable place to live. But now Jessica's living there rent-free, while I'm the one footing the bill. How is that fair? She hesitated again, then said, We thought you'd understand. You've always been the one we can rely on. Jessica, she's different. She needs help. I'd heard this so many times before that it felt like a script. I've been helping her my entire life, I said. And every time I do, it's never enough. When is she going to take responsibility for herself? When are you going to stop bailing her out? I can't believe you're being like this, Mom said, her voice trembling. We're a family. Families help each other. Families also respect each other, I shot back. And you didn't respect me enough to tell me what was happening. You just made the decision and expected me to go along with it. Dad came on the line then, clearly having overheard. Son, calm down, he said. We didn't mean to upset you. We thought this was just a family decision, not something you'd need to be involved in. I almost laughed at how ridiculous that sounded. How is this not my decision? I'm the one paying for the house. I'm the one making sacrifices to keep the mortgage covered. But you didn't even think to ask me. You just handed the place over to Jessica like it was no big deal. Dad's tone turned defensive. You're acting like we did something terrible. We're just trying to help your sister. It's not like we're asking you to do anything extra. You are asking me to do something extra, I said, my frustration boiling over. You're asking me to keep paying for a house I don't even live in, while Jessica gets to stay there without contributing anything. That's more than unfair. It's insulting. There was another long pause. Finally, Dad said, We didn't think you'd make such a big deal out of this. You've always been the responsible one. We thought you'd want to help. That phrase, you've always been the responsible one, hit me like a slap in the face. It wasn't a compliment. It was an excuse. A way to justify every unfair thing they'd ever asked of me. I'm done, I said firmly. I'm not paying the mortgage anymore unless Jessica moves out or starts contributing. This is the last time I'm letting you guilt me into something like this. Mom gasped. You can't mean that. I do, I said. You've taken advantage of me for long enough. I'm setting boundaries, and if you don't like it, that's your problem. They didn't respond right away. When they finally spoke, their voices were filled with disappointment, like I'd let them down. We thought you cared about this family, Mom said softly. I do, I said. But I also care about myself, and I can't keep sacrificing everything for people who don't respect me. I've given you more than enough, and I'm done. I hung up before they could say anything else. For the first time in years, I felt like I'd taken control of my own life. But it didn't feel good. Not yet. I wasn't used to standing up to them, and the guilt was already creeping in. But deep down, I knew I'd made the right choice. It was time to put myself first, no matter how much it hurt. After that call, I expected a blow-up. I was ready for angry voicemails, guilt-laden texts, even an ambush at my apartment door. But instead, I got silence. At first, it felt almost eerie. I kept checking my phone, bracing for the inevitable, but days went by without a word from them. Then the calls started, sporadic at first, then relentless. Mom left long, tearful voicemails about how she couldn't believe I was abandoning the family. She kept saying, We've always been there for you. How can you turn your back on us now? Dad's tone was angrier. You're being selfish, he said in one voicemail. After everything we've done for you, you can't even do this one thing for your sister? And then there was Jessica. She sent text after text, all dripping with entitlement. Wow, so you're just gonna let me lose my home, one message read. Another said, I don't get why you're making this such a big deal. It's not like you need the money. I ignored all of it. Every call, every message, every attempt to reel me back in. I let it go unanswered. It wasn't easy. Each time my phone buzzed, I felt a pang of guilt, like I was doing something wrong. But I reminded myself that this wasn't my fault. They'd put me in this position, not the other way around. It didn't take long for things to unravel. Without me covering the mortgage, the payments fell behind almost immediately. Within 2 months, the bank sent a foreclosure notice. Mom called me in a panic, begging me to step in. "They're going to take the house," she cried. "You can't let this happen." "I already told you," I said firmly. "I'm not paying for it anymore. If you and Jessica want to keep the house, you'll have to figure something out." She started sobbing, and for a moment, I felt the old guilt rising in my chest. But then I remembered all the years I'd spent putting their needs ahead of mine, all the sacrifices I'd made while they took without giving anything back. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "But this isn't my responsibility anymore." Jessica called next, and her tone was venomous. "I can't believe you're doing this to me," she snapped. "You're ruining my life." "Your life isn't my responsibility," I said, cutting her off. "I've been supporting you for years, and it's time for you to stand on your own. If the house means that much to you, find a way to pay for it." She hung up on me, and for the first time in months, I felt relief. A few weeks later, the house was gone. The bank sold it at auction, and Jessica had to move out. Mom and Dad ended up renting a small apartment in a cheaper part of town. I heard about it through a mutual friend. Neither of them bothered to tell me directly. The fallout wasn't pretty. Mom sent one last email, full of disappointment and guilt. "We never thought you'd turn out like this," she wrote. "You used to care about your family. What happened to you?" I didn't respond. There was no point. They didn't see me as a person with my own life, my own struggles, and my own dreams. To them, I was a resource, a safety net, someone they could rely on no matter how much it cost me. The silence that followed was both a relief and a sadness I couldn't quite shake. I missed the good moments, the times when I felt like they actually cared about me, not just what I could do for them. But I knew those moments had been overshadowed by years of expectations and guilt. For the first time, I started to focus on myself. I moved into a new apartment, small, but mine. I started saving again, this time for something I wanted, my own future. It felt strange, almost selfish, to put myself first, but it also felt right. Jessica, from what I've heard, is still figuring things out. She's working part-time at a coffee shop and renting a room in someone's house. She's bitter, of course, and blames me for everything that went wrong. But I don't let it bother me. For the first time, she's living with the consequences of her own choices, and that's something she needed to learn a long time ago. As for my parents, they've adjusted to their new situation, but things between us are distant. They still think I'm in the wrong, that I should have kept supporting them no matter what. I doubt they'll ever see it from my perspective, and I've accepted that. It's not easy to walk away from family, even when you know it's the right thing to do. There are days when I second-guess myself, wondering if I could have handled things differently. But then I remember how it felt to carry the weight of their expectations, to sacrifice my own happiness for theirs, and I know I made the right choice. I'm finally free to live my own life, and for the first time, that feels like enough. Months passed, and the dust from the foreclosure finally settled. The calls stopped entirely, and the silence that followed was both strange and comforting. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. I'd spent so many years revolving my life around my family's needs that having space to breathe felt unfamiliar. I started small. I focused on work, took on a couple of new projects, and found myself actually enjoying it instead of grinding through it just for a paycheck. I began setting goals, not for anyone else, but for me. It felt selfish at first, but as time went on, it started to feel right. One of the first things I did was open a savings account specifically for my future. I called it the Freedom Fund. I didn't have a clear picture of what I was saving for. Maybe a house of my own, or a trip, or just the security of knowing I could make decisions without worrying about money. For the first time, every dollar I saved felt like progress, not a sacrifice. I also started reconnecting with old friends, people I drifted away from over the years. They didn't know the full story of what had happened with my family, but they didn't need to. Just being around people who didn't expect anything from me, who were happy to see me for me, was refreshing. One evening, I was sitting in my apartment, flipping through old photos on my phone. There was a picture of my parents at the housewarming party I'd thrown for them when they first moved in. They looked so happy, so proud. For a moment, I felt a pang of regret. Maybe I should have handled things differently. Maybe I should have tried harder to make them understand how much I'd already given. But then I remembered all the times they'd dismissed my feelings, all the ways they'd taken without thinking about what it cost me. The guilt was still there, lingering at the edges, but it didn't feel as heavy as it used to. A few weeks later, I got a text from my dad. It was short, just a couple of sentences. "We hope you're doing well. Let us know if you ever want to talk." It wasn't an apology, but it also wasn't a guilt trip. For the first time, it felt like they were reaching out without expecting anything in return. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be ready. The last I heard about Jessica was through a mutual acquaintance. She'd picked up a second part-time job and was renting a room in a shared house. Apparently, she was still upset with me, still telling people how unfair it was that I'd abandoned her. But I didn't let it bother me. For the first time in her life, she was standing on her own, even if she didn't want to admit it. As for my parents, they seemed to be managing. They downsized to a modest apartment and were living within their means for the first time in years. I knew they blamed me for how things had turned out, but I also knew they'd adjusted. They were fine. And I was fine too. Actually, I was more than fine. I was free. Free to make my own decisions, to live my life without feeling like I owed anyone anything. I started making plans for the future. Real plans. I wanted to travel, to explore places I'd only seen in pictures. I wanted to buy a house of my own, not for anyone else, but just for me. I wanted a life where every choice I made was mine. Looking back, I don't regret what I did. It took me too long to see the truth, but I'm glad I finally did. Family should be about love and respect, not obligation and sacrifice. For years, I thought giving everything to my family was the right thing to do, but now I see that it was just enabling them to take advantage of me. I don't know if my parents or Jessica will ever fully understand why I had to walk away. To them, I'll probably always be the selfish son, the brother who turned his back on them. But I've made peace with that. Because now, for the first time, I'm living a life that belongs to me. And that's worth everything.